That morning, the entire Arizona Zoo erupted into chaos as alarms blared. A jaguar had broken free. Visitors scattered, guards slammed gates shut, panic rippled through every walkway. Yet, in the middle of all that hysteria, one gray-haired veteran didn't move an inch, his eyes locked on the approaching shadow of the jaguar. No one understood why, until the creature made a sound that silenced the entire park.
Before we step into today's story, I'd love to hear from you. If you're watching, just drop a simple word in the comments. Something like "here" or "listening." It helps me know you're with me on this journey. And if you enjoy true stories, filled with heart, courage, and those moments that stay with us long after they end, I'd be honored to have you subscribe. There are many more stories ahead, and I'd love for you to walk through them with me.
The desert morning didn't arrive with drama. It slipped in slowly over Desert Ridge Zoo, turning the sky from ink to pale copper. In the Jaguar house, the air was still cool, faintly smelling of damp concrete and raw meat. In the darkest corner of the holding pen, an old jaguar lay curled tight, his breathing slow, ribs lifting and falling like a tired bellows. The keepers called him Rocco. On the paperwork, he was just male, 21 years. For years, his world had been a careful rhythm of doors sliding, locks clanking, keepers' footsteps, and the distant murmur of visitors on the other side of glass. He knew the sound of the meat cart's squeaky wheel, the shift in the gravel when the vet walked past, the way the air changed when storms rolled in from the mountains. This morning, none of those sounds came. The only thing that woke him was the wind. It slipped through the tiny vents high on the wall, dragging the dry scent of Arizona dust and sun-warmed concrete into the holding pen. Rocco's ear twitched first, then his whiskers. For a long moment he stayed where he was, eyes closed, letting the air move over his scarred muzzle. Then something threaded through the dust and disinfectant, faint and impossible, and his eyes opened. They were clouded now, the golden light of youth washed out to a softer amber, but they were not dull. He lifted his head slowly, joints complaining, and inhaled again. The zoo's usual smells, hay, chlorine from the nearby splash pad, popcorn from the snack stand warming up, sat on the edges. Underneath it, deeper, older, was something that made his chest tighten, the way it had not tightened in years. Outside, the zoo was beginning to wake. Golf carts hummed along service paths. A school bus hissed to a stop by the gate, releasing a wave of chatter and backpack zippers. Near the Jaguar exhibit, Lily Nguyen checked the latch on the night den, her hands moving quickly, still getting used to the routine. Her radio crackled at her hip, Ethan Cole's voice reminding staff to be ready for the Saturday rush. None of them looked toward the vents. Rocco did. He pushed himself up, paws spreading across the concrete as he stood. The ache in his hips flared sharp, then settled into the familiar burn he carried like an old story. He ignored it. The wind shifted again, sliding through the vents in a narrow stream. The scent came with it, thin but unmistakable, and something deep in him, older than bars, older than this place, shuddered awake. He paced once, twice, from one side of the holding pen to the other, claws clicking softly on the floor. He'd paced before, when fireworks rattled the city on holidays, when thunderstorms made the walls hum. But this was different. Every time he turned, his head snapped back toward the same corner, toward that sliver of air where the outside world seeped in. His tail flicked low, not in irritation, but in a restless, searching rhythm. On the public side of the exhibit, the viewing glass still sat dark. A maintenance worker named Jared swept popcorn kernels from last night's crowd, humming off key to a country song from his earbuds. Above him, a banner read "Big Cats of the Americas" in bold letters. If he had looked through the back wall, he would have seen Rocco's silhouette moving faster now, shoulders bunching as if some unseen hand were tugging him forward. In the control room, multiple screens flickered on, showing sleepy animals starting their day. A young tech, Miguel, sipped coffee and watched as Rocco's camera feed snapped from stillness into motion. He frowned, leaning closer. The Jaguar was pacing hard, head up, nostrils flaring. Miguel tapped the glass of his monitor as if that would settle the animal. It didn't. Rocco stopped only long enough to stare straight into the tiny lens, eyes sharp, as if checking whether something was finally about to change. The sound system test boomed faintly through the zoo, one long tone, then silence. Rocco's ears flattened for a heartbeat, his chest rising faster now. The wind tugged at him again, carrying that same thin thread of scent. It was older now, layered with dusts and strangers and years he couldn't count, but it was still there. Recognition moved through him like a slow, painful spark, lighting up places in his memory he'd let go quiet long ago. He stepped toward the inner door, the one that separated his holding pen from the back of the main enclosure. Heavy steel, double latch, always firm, always final. He pressed his nose to the seam and breathed in. On the other side, he could smell fresh hay spread by Lily earlier, the faint oil from the keeper's gloves, the cool shadow of the artificial rocks. Beyond that, beyond glass and railings and pathways, the scent grew stronger, as if the wind itself were urging him forward. In the staff corridor outside, Lily walked past with a bucket and a checklist, double-checking her morning tasks. She paused at Rocco's door when she heard the thud of his weight against it, surprise knitting her brows. He hadn't moved like that in months. "Easy, old man," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She checked the top latch, giving it a firm tug. Then her phone buzzed with a text. Her hand shifted, her attention split for one distracted second. Inside, Rocco shoved again, not in panic, but with a steady insistence that made the metal frame vibrate. The bolt held, but the bottom hinge gave a small, tired creak it hadn't given yesterday. He pulled back, sides heaving, eyes still fixed on that unmoving line of steel. Somewhere beyond it, carried on dry desert air and human noise, was a heartbeat he had once slept beside. He didn't know how far he'd have to go. He only knew he could not stay where he was. The zoo loudspeakers crackled as the gates opened to the public. Kids streamed in, their voices bouncing off concrete and glass. A teacher shouted instructions to a group in matching T-shirts. Near the front entrance, an old man with a cane stepped through the turnstile, pausing just long enough to glance up at the Jaguar banner fluttering above. He held his breath for a second, as if bracing for impact, then exhaled and moved on. At the far end of the park, in a narrow holding pen, Rocco lowered his head, gathered what strength he had left, and pushed against the door one more time. For a little while after the door finally gave, Rocco didn't move. The latch hadn't burst with a dramatic snap. It had slipped, just enough for metal to breathe and the frame to shift. A narrow gap opened along the edge, spilling a thin blade of a brighter light across the concrete. He stood there, sides heaving, staring at that light like it was an old road. He'd almost forgotten how to walk. He pressed his nose into the crack first, drawing in air that hadn't been filtered through vents and bars. It smelled harsher and messier than the holding pen. Hot rubber from service carts, sunscreen, spilled soda, the sharp tang of cleaning chemicals. But under all of it, that same faint thread tugged at him. His whiskers flicked, his ears lifted. Whatever his body remembered as pain, his memory overruled it. With a slow, deliberate push of his shoulder, he widened the opening just enough. The door groaned in protest, then settled. Rocco slipped through sideways, ribs brushing cold steel, claws scraping metal. For a heartbeat, his hind leg caught, and his right hip screamed. He paused, jaw tightening, then dragged himself the rest of the way out. When he straightened, he was no longer in the familiar dim box. The corridor beyond felt like another country. The staff hallway ran in both directions, lined with grey doors and mop buckets, lit by humming fluorescent tubes. To his left, air drifted in from the main exhibit, carrying the comfort of shadow and familiar stone. To his right, a stronger current pulled, hotter, noisier, full of footsteps and distant voices. Rocco turned toward the pull without hesitation. His tail brushed the wall, leaving a streak of pale dust in the coarse fur as he moved. Far ahead, through a half-open service gate, he could glimpse a sliver of sky. It was bright and washed out, so different from the soft morning light that used to leak into that border outpost long ago. He didn't think of the years in between in words. He felt them in the stiffness of his joints, in the weight of his shoulders, in the way each step cost more than the last. Still, he kept going, drawn by the smell that now pressed like a thumbprint against his mind. He passed a rolling cart parked crooked against the wall, towels half folded in a bin. The scent of the keeper who'd been there clung to it. Lily's soap, her shampoo, the faint coffee she liked to drink before dawn. Rocco barely glanced at it. He knew her, trusted her in the way a wild animal learns to tolerate hands that never push too far. But she was not the one the wind had delivered back to him. His head stayed tilted, nostrils flaring, hearing and sight narrowed to a long, invisible line. On the plaza outside, Desert Ridge Zoo had fully woken. Children clustered near mapboards. Strollers squeaked across textured paths. A vendor rattled open a metal shutter, the smell of warming pretzels rolling out into the dry air. Above it all, the Jaguar banner fluttered lazily, its printed cat frozen mid-leap. No one on that bright concrete knew that the real Jaguar was already on the move behind the scenes, closing the distance between a broken door and a broken promise. The first scream came when he pushed through the service gate. It wasn't loud at first, more a sharp intake of breath from a groundskeeper who turned at the wrong moment. Rocco stepped into sunlight, pupils shrinking, fur catching a dusting of gold. For a second, he simply stood there, tasting the open space, listening to the way sound bounced differently when there were no bars between him and the sky. Then the human's radio hit the ground, clattering, and the world pitched. Within moments, the calm shattered. Someone near the flamingo pond shouted, "Jaguar!" in a voice that cracked on the last syllable. A mother grabbed her toddler so fast the child dropped his plush toy on the path. Sneakers slammed against concrete, the rhythm of 100 hearts suddenly deciding they wanted to be somewhere else. Overhead, speakers crackled as the practiced calm of an announcer tried and failed to flatten the edge of panic. Rocco felt the change in the air as clearly as he smelled it. Fear had its own weight, its own bitter tang. It prickled along his spine, urged him to brace, to crouch, to slip back into the old patterns of a hunter. But the wind was still moving, still bringing him that other scent, older, quieter, threaded with dry paper and worn cotton and something like smoke. He lifted his head higher, ignoring the way the crowd peeled away from him, like water flowing around a stone. Across the plaza, people were scattering in all directions, but one figure didn't move. He was thinner than the memory Rocco carried, hair whiter, shoulders bowed beneath a faded jacket that had seen more than one kind of dust. A worn cane stood planted beside his foot like a flag. While others ran, he simply stood there, watching, his face caught somewhere between terror and an ache so deep it almost looked like relief. The scent that had dragged Rocco from his pen clung to that man like a second skin. For a long breath, Jaguar and Veteran stared at each other across the widening circle of empty pavement. Rocco's chest rose and fell in jagged bursts, not from exertion, but from something his body didn't quite know how to name. The last time his heart had hammered like this, there had been snow on the ground, and a younger set of hands holding a bottle under his nose. The sounds of the zoo blurred, the shouting, the radios, the distant wail of a siren being tested. All that remained. Clear was the man's eyes and the steady shape of him refusing to flee. He took a step forward. It was small, but it felt as huge as crossing a river. His claws touched down softly, the muscles along his shoulders tightening, then loosening with slow control. He did not lower his head to charge. He did not flatten his ears or whip his tail. He moved as if he were approaching a fire he had been cold without for too long, afraid of startling it into going out. Somewhere behind him, someone shouted for a clear shot. He kept going. The distance between them shrank. 20 feet, 15, 10. Rocco could hear the old man's breathing now, a little too fast, catching on something inside the chest. He could see the tremor in the man's hand, where it hovered near his cane, fingers twitching, as if caught between training and instinct. A gust of wind slid between them, stirring Rocco's whiskers, carrying the scent he'd followed all this way straight into his lungs. It hit him like a slow, deep bell, ringing in places no one else could see. He made a sound then, low and unsteady, rising from somewhere far back in his throat. It wasn't the full-bodied roar that rattled glass, wasn't the warning growl he'd given keepers who moved too fast. It was shorter, softer, a broken echo of the small breaths he'd once let out when he pressed his face into the fabric of a jacket and fell asleep to the beat of a human heart. The man's eyes filled with something wet and bright. His lips parted, and though Rocco didn't understand the word, he knew the shape of it, knew the way it wrapped around him like it always had. For a moment, everything around him seemed to slow. The crowd, the alarms, the click of a safety being flipped off somewhere behind him, all of it faded to a dull hum at the edge of Rocco's awareness. He saw only the man ahead, that bent frame in the worn jacket, the familiar shape of those shoulders. The scent wrapping around him was like opening a door he thought was sealed forever. Behind Rocco, boots pounded across concrete. Ethan Cole moved into position, body low, tranquilizer rifle snug against his shoulder. Years of drills lined up in his muscles. Identify, aim, neutralize. Through the scope, the Jaguar's rosetted coat filled the crosshairs. Ethan swallowed hard. The cat was too close to the old man. One wrong move, and there wouldn't be time to correct a mistake. Rocco's ear twitched at the sharp, mechanical click from behind, but he didn't turn. The field of his attention had narrowed to a single point, the way it did when he hunted as a younger animal. But this wasn't about hunger. It was about recognition. The old man's lips moved again. The word came out rough, catching on years of silence, but its tone struck Rocco like a soft blow. It was the sound his life had once orbited around. Shadow. The name floated between them, thinner and more frayed than it used to be, but unchanged where it counted. The Jaguar didn't understand language the way people did, but he understood patterns, rhythms, the way certain sounds meant warmth and food and safety. That sound had once meant all three. His chest tightened until his next breath came out in a shaky huff. He stepped closer, every line in his body broadcasting control. No lunging, no sudden burst of speed, just a slow, careful advance. His head stayed level, ears angled forward, tail low and steady. Fear in the air spiked anyway. A child somewhere screamed. A stroller wheel jammed against a bench with a clang. Rocco's muscles flinched, but his feet didn't change direction. Near the snack stand, Lily stood frozen with a tray of paper cups half filled with ice. She'd never seen Rocco move like this, threading through open space, ignoring all the easy targets, walking as if he were following an invisible track no one else could see. Her radio barked in her ear, Ethan shouting for everyone to get down. She couldn't make herself look away from the way the old cat's shoulders rose and fell. High above, the hot Arizona light caught in Rocco's eyes, turning them into two pieces of worn amber. In some other life, he would have used this brightness, this open ground to his advantage, sinking into shadow and cover. Now he walked openly, exposed on every side. The only cover he seemed to want was the narrowing space between himself and the man who had spoken that word. The man's hand lifted, shaking, as if it remembered reaching for a much smaller animal. The scent grew stronger with each step. Old denim, clean sweat, the faint medicinal tang clinging to skin that had known too many hospitals. Beneath it, buried but stubborn, was the ghost of something else. Wood smoke, cheap coffee, desert dust. Rocco's mind didn't sort them out one by one. It just filed them under a single deep knowing. This is home. Not a place, not a pen or a box of rocks, but this specific human. Somewhere to Rocco's left, a slim figure edged into the open. Ryan, phone held high, hands trembling, kept the Jaguar and the old man both in frame. He wasn't thinking about clicks anymore. His own breath sounded loud in his ears as he whispered unknowingly into the mic. He's going straight to him. He's not even looking at anyone else. What is happening right now? Ethan shifted his stance, trying to find a line of fire that didn't put the old man at risk. Sweat slid down between his shoulder blades. "Sir," he shouted, voice cracking. "Back up! Get behind me!" The veteran didn't move. His cane lay forgotten at his feet, fingers now reaching out, palm open, as if offering the Jaguar a choice. Rocco's gaze dipped to that hand, then back to the eyes above it. For the first time since stepping into the plaza, Rocco stopped moving. He stood just out of reach now, so close he could hear the tiny wheeze at the end of the man's exhale. They regarded each other in a silence so deep it cut through the alarms, The jaguar's ears eased slightly, his shoulders dropping a fraction. The pose would have looked like surrender to someone who didn't know cats. To Rocco, it was something closer to trust. Then, as gently as if he were greeting a skittish cub, he made that sound again. A soft, breathy chuff, air pushed through barely parted jaws. It was a sound he'd saved over years of handlers and vets and curious faces, never spending it on anyone. The last time he'd used it, snow had been falling outside a different chain-link fence, and a younger version of this same man had rubbed sleep from his eyes to answer a midnight cry. The old man's face crumpled, lines deepening as if years were sliding back over him all at once. He whispered the name again, steadier this time. Rocco took another step, closing the space until he could see the small scar along the man's jaw he remembered head-butting when his own paws were still too big for his body. Around them, the zoo held its breath, waiting for claws or teeth or a shot. Instead, the big cat simply lowered his head, bringing his nose level with that outstretched hand, the past and present balanced on a few inches of air. The plaza seemed to hold its breath as Rocco hovered inches from the outstretched hand. Sunlight warmed his whiskers, glinting off the rosettes along his back, but he didn't flinch or stray. He stayed locked in that fragile stillness, drawn toward the man not by instinct, but by a memory so old it lived deeper than fear. Around them, the crowd's panic softened into something quieter, almost reverent. Frank's fingers trembled as he lowered his hand closer, not daring to touch, not daring to break whatever miracle was unfolding. His eyes glistened, the kind of shine that came from recognizing a face you buried years ago. The jaguar's breath brushed over his palm, warm and uneven. For the first time since stepping into the open, Rocco blinked slowly, one long, deliberate gesture that spoke more clearly than words could. Behind them, Nora Kaplan stepped forward just enough to see the jaguar's posture. Her breath caught. Every muscle in Rocco's body showed restraint. No tension, no coiled readiness, only an aching sort of longing. She whispered into her radio that the animal wasn't exhibiting aggression, but even as she spoke, her voice shook from the weight of what she was witnessing. Big cats didn't act like this, not after this many years in captivity. Ethan held his rifle steady, but sweat ran cold down the side of his temple. The scene through the scope didn't look like a predator sizing up prey. It looked like something much older and more human. Still, protocol screamed in his ear, demanding he act before the jaguar closed the last inches. He tried to shout another warning, but found his throat tight, as if the sight itself had stolen the command from him. Rocco lifted his head slightly, catching another thread of scent off the breeze. It brushed across, his face like an echo of the past. Bonfire smoke, desert sage, the faint musk of a coat once warmed by winter sun. The scents layered and folded, pulling forth things he didn't understand in words, only in sensation. Nights pressed against a beating heart, gentle hands brushing dust from his fur. A voice telling him he was safe. That voice stood before him now, aged, but unchanged in its core. Frank swallowed, the movement visible even from yards away. "Shadow, boy," he whispered, the name breaking on the edges. The moment it left his lips, Rocco's ears tilted forward, and a tremor ran along his spine. The jaguar stepped closer, closing the gap until the warmth of the man's hand hovered above his muzzle. The familiar syllables settled into him like a long-lost call home. A hush rippled through the scattered onlookers. Even children, still clinging to parents, watched with wide, uncertain eyes. Somewhere, a phone chimed, recording every second. Ryan's camera caught the way Rocco leaned in, not forceful, not bold, but careful, almost seeking permission. If a wild animal could ask a question, that was how it looked. If it could beg for something unforgettable to be returned, it would look like this. Lily moved to Nora's side, breath unsteady. "He knows him," she whispered. "He really does." Nora didn't answer. She was too busy tracing the lines of Rocco's body, how his shoulders dipped, how his tail stayed low and soft, how his jaw loosened instead of tensing. Everything in the Jaguar's stance radiated recognition. Not curiosity, not confusion. Recognition. Frank finally let his hand rest against the Jaguar's muzzle, fingers sinking gently into the warm fur. Rocco froze, not in fear, but in something closer to awe. His breath stuttered, chest rising in a quiet, uneven rhythm that felt less like an animal's reaction and more like a reunion of two living things who had once carried each other through a lonely piece of the world. The touch unlocked something deep inside the Jaguar. He pushed forward just an inch, brushing his nose into the man's palm, the way he used to when he was small and uncertain. A soft, broken rumble rose in his chest, half chuff, half sigh, sounding like the fragile memory of a purr. Several people gasped. A woman nearby sank to her knees, hands clasped over her mouth. Even Ethan's rifle lowered slightly. But the tenderness of the moment didn't erase the truth of danger. A siren blared from somewhere outside the plaza as backup arrived at the zoo entrance. The sharp noise made Rocco's muscles twitch, but instead of pulling away, he pressed a little closer to Frank's hand, as if anchoring himself. The man's thumb brushed over the Jaguar's scar, an old injury the keepers had always wondered about. Frank didn't wonder. He knew exactly where it came from. The air shifted again, carrying the dry scent of desert heat and asphalt toward them. Rocco stepped until his forehead hovered at Frank's chest height, but he didn't lean in fully. He waited, for reassurance, for permission, for whatever bond had tied them once before. Frank's breath cracked as he whispered, "I'm right here, son. I'm right here." Rocco exhaled a long, trembling breath against the veteran's shirt, settling into a posture that made no sense to the security team, no sense to the crowd, but perfect sense to the Jaguar's heart. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in recognition, in remembrance, in relief. Around them, for a fragile moment, the alarms felt distant. The crowd softened into still silhouettes, and the Jaguar, once a creature of shadows and instinct, leaned gently into the touch of the only person he had ever trusted enough to remember. The desert light shifted softly across the plaza as Rocco leaned into the old man's touch, but somewhere inside him another memory stirred, one older, quieter, shaped not by fear or hunger but by warmth. It rose slowly, like a lantern being lifted in a dark room. His breath settled, his eyes softened, and without warning, the world around him faded into a different landscape entirely. Snow. He remembered snow first. Not much, just a thin crust along the porch of a remote border outpost where cold bit through cracked windows. The cub he once had been trembled then, a tiny bundle of wet fur and fragile ribs. A thick coat wrapped around him, smelling of wood smoke, and the man who carried him. Rocco hadn't understood the world yet, but he understood that heartbeat beneath his cheek. Frank's hand now trembled the same way it had trembled then. He brushed his thumb along Rocco's muzzle in a rhythm so familiar it pierced through decades. "Easy, Shadow," he whispered, barely louder than breath. The Jaguar's ears flicked as the name reached a place inside him he hadn't touched since youth. A pocket of warmth carved by firelight, soft blankets, and survival offered without condition. In the memory, Frank had sat cross-legged on the floor of the rescue shack, warming formula over a small propane burner. The young cub had pressed clumsy paws into Frank's thigh, insisting on curling into his lap after every feeding. Those tiny sounds he made, short puffs of air, soft trills, were the same noises now trembling in his throat. Time had worn his body, but it hadn't erased that first bond. The plaza came back into focus as Rocco blinked, the ghost of snow fading into sunlit concrete. People stared from behind benches and railings, unsure whether they were watching a miracle or a disaster waiting to happen. But the Jaguar didn't care about the fear around him. He stepped closer, the tip of his nose brushing the fabric of Frank's jacket. The scent was older, sharper in places, but still undeniably the same. Nora Kaplan exhaled shakily as she studied the Jaguar's posture. "He's remembering," she murmured to herself. The idea felt unbelievable, yet every small gesture supported it. The slow blink, the lowered head, the quivering breath. These weren't signs of territorial dominance, they were echoes of a bond forged long before the zoo, long before cages and concrete and steel. Rocco nudged Frank's chest again, firmer this time, as if searching for that steady heartbeat he had once fallen asleep to. The old man's hand steadied, fingers spreading across Rocco's cheek in a gesture that belonged to another lifetime. Behind them, the crowd fell so quiet that even the faint rustle of leaves carried. For a moment, it felt as if the entire zoo leaned in to listen. The memory deepened. Rocco saw flashes. Frank cutting away the snare that had nearly cost him his life. Frank humming low tunes at dawn while stirring formula. Frank carrying him through a storm. When thunder made him cry out for a mother who would never return. That early love had saved him. It had shaped him. And then, just as quickly, life had torn them apart. Frank felt the Jaguar's breath trembling against him now, and the guilt he'd buried for decades pressed hard against his ribs. He remembered the day Shadow, Rocco, was taken from him, the truck, the crate, his own helpless promises, a vow he couldn't keep, the accident that stole his chance to follow. All of it slammed into him as the Jaguar leaned closer, recognizing him with a devotion he no longer felt he deserved. Rocco inhaled deeply, drawing in the old man's scent with a desperate tenderness. In his mind, fragments rewove themselves, the warmth of feeding bottles, the rough feel of Frank's jacket, the sheltering weight of a hand pressed gently along his spine. He lowered himself slightly, a hesitant motion, almost bowing, not out of submission, but out of memory. Ethan Cole watched through the rifle scope, hands trembling. He'd never seen a big cat behave this way, especially not one this old, this wounded, this far from its enclosure. He lowered the gun a fraction as Nora whispered urgently, "Look at his tail. Look at his ears. Ethan, that animal is not in attack mode. He's reconnecting." The old Jaguar tilted his head, resting it lightly against Frank's chest. The man's breath caught at the contact. His hand slid into Rocco's mane, thumb brushing the coarse fur along a scar he remembered dressing when it had been no bigger than a fingernail. Time hadn't erased the feel of that scar. It hadn't erased anything. Rocco exhaled a long, shuddering breath, the kind that emptied worry and filled space with something gentler. Around them, tension eased just a fraction. A few of the children who had been crying moments before now peeked out from behind parents. Even the air itself seemed to grow softer, settling like dust after a long storm. Frank closed his eyes, forehead lowering just enough to touch Rocco's. "I never forgot you," he whispered. "Not once." The Jaguar responded with a low, steady rumble, half greeting, half plea, vibrating through the space between them. It was the sound of a memory answering back, reshaping itself into something alive. And as the plaza stood wrapped in that quiet, impossible reunion, Rocco, the Jaguar who had lived more years in loneliness than in comfort, let his weight rest fully beside the only human he had ever trusted enough to remember. The sound of the plaza slowly dimmed in Rocco's mind, replaced by something heavier, an ache that pulsed beneath his ribs like an old bruise waking up. Pressed against the veteran's chest, he could feel a familiar heartbeat, yet the memory tied to it carried a sharp edge. Love and loss lived side by side in that rhythm. He blinked slowly, and the warmth of the sun shifted into the pale, washed-out light of another morning long ago. The cub he once was sat inside a wire enclosure, shivering as men in uniforms loaded crates into a waiting truck. Snow clung to the tires. The wind tasted of metal and fear. He had cried until his throat hurt, but only one man answered him. Frank had knelt in the freezing mud, jacket sleeves damp, stroking the little Jaguar's head through the gaps. His breath had fogged against the bars as he whispered soft promises Rocco couldn't understand in words, only in tone. They meant, "I'll follow you." They meant, "You aren't alone." They meant, "This isn't goodbye." But voices shouted from the truck. Papers were signed. Hands pulled Frank back. The crate lifted, swaying, and the cub pressed his small paws against the metal, desperate to stay near that warmth. He didn't know why the man couldn't follow. He only knew the distance between them was growing, and the cold inside the crate was spreading through him like a second winter. Back in the present, Frank's hand tightened in Rocco's fur, as if he felt the same memory rolling through them both. His breath trembled. He whispered an apology only the Jaguar could hear. The sorrow in his voice sank deep, stirring something that had lain buried for decades. The Jaguar's tail brushed the ground in a slow, troubled sweep. Nora watched the moment with a tightening in her chest. "He's reliving something," she murmured, half to herself. Rocco's posture had shifted, not fearful, not aggressive, but weighted with a kind of grief no training manual prepared her for. She could see it in the low angle of his head, in the way he leaned without fully resting. A gust of wind swept across the plaza, stirring loose papers and carrying faint echoes of the past. Rocco closed his eyes and snow returned, not the soft flakes from early winter, but the hard, wind-driven kind that stung his ears as the truck rumbled down the mountain road. He had cried then too, but no one knew the difference between fear and longing in the voice of a cub. Frank remembered that day with a pain so sharp it seemed to hollow him out. The doctors had called it an accident. Wrong place, wrong hour, metal twisting in the median. As the rescue truck rolled out of sight, by the time he woke in the hospital, Shadow was already miles away. He had sworn he would find him again, but life had its own storms, and his body was never the same. Rocco shifted now, as if sensing the old injury. He touched his forehead lightly to the man's shoulder, a gesture he had once used as a cub to ask for reassurance. The crowd saw only a dangerous animal closing in. But Ethan saw something else in the scope, an old creature, remembering where it came from. The Jaguar exhaled, long and uneven, and the sound carried the weight of years spent waiting without knowing what he waited for. The keepers had called it pacing, stress, age. They hadn't known it was the echo of a promise buried in his bones. The warmth he lost wasn't gone. It was simply far away. Frank steadied himself, one hand pressed to his ribs, as if old wounds had woken. His voice cracked as he murmured, "You were just a baby. You didn't understand." Rocco responded with a soft, broken huff, pressing closer, each movement slow enough to show he meant no harm, only remembrance. The sky above brightened as clouds shifted, letting sunlight warm the Jaguar's back. The plaza felt strangely quiet, as though everyone sensed they were witnessing a story resurfacing from beneath years of dust. Rocco lifted his head, eyes meeting the man's with a depth no animal behavior chart could measure. And then, with the gentlest motion he had left, the old Jaguar placed one paw beside Frank's foot. Careful, steady, a silent declaration. It was the same gesture he had made as a cub when he wanted Frank to stay. The past had broken them once, but here, in this fragile sunlight, it knit itself back together for the first time in decades. In the control room above the plaza, the world looked different. It was broken into squares of color and motion, each camera feed showing a slice of the zoo. For a moment, no one spoke. All eyes were locked on the screen, where an old Jaguar leaned against an old man, their bodies touching like two pieces of the same story, finally lined up again. Miguel, the young tech, realized he'd stopped breathing. A half-full coffee cup sat forgotten near his elbow, steam fading. "That's Rocco," he said softly, as if anyone in the room could mistake him. The old cat's rosettes filled the frame. His head bowed, his chest rising in a slow, uneven rhythm that didn't match panic at all. Ethan burst through the control room door with his rifle still in hand, face flushed, shirt clinging damp to his back. "Pull every angle on Sector C," he ordered. "I want to see how he got out." His voice sounded too loud in the small room, crashing against the quiet ore hanging there. Nobody moved until Nora stepped in behind him and laid a calming hand on the back of a chair. On the main monitor, somebody hit rewind. The image jumped backward, Rocco lifting his head from Frank's chest, stepping away, walking in, reversed toward the service gate. Another tap, and the timestamp rolled back further. Now he was on the inside of the holding door again, pacing along the length of the pen like a caged storm that hadn't found its lightning yet. Nora leaned in close, eyes narrowing. "Stop there," she said. "Back it up 30 seconds. They watched as the earlier hour unfolded, Rocco lying still, little more than a shadow in the dim pen. Then, all at once, his head snapped up, his nose lifted, flaring. His entire body changed, waking from a tired doze into something lit from the inside. As the footage played, they could hear the faint audio from that camera, just enough to catch the low, tremulous sound he made. It was not a roar, not even a full growl. It was a thin, wavering call, strangely small for a cat his size. Nora felt the hair on her arms rise. "That's a juvenile distress call," she murmured. He hasn't made that sound in years. Another screen flickered as the front gate camera came online. Time stamps lined up along the bottom. At the exact moment Rocco's nose lifted in the holding pen, the front entrance showed a man with a cane stepping through the turnstile. The same worn jacket, the same slow, careful walk, the same scent riding the desert air straight to a forgotten memory. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're saying he smelled that guy from all the way back there?" he asked, nodding toward the plaza. His tone carried disbelief, but not dismissal. He had just watched a fully grown jaguar rest his head on a stranger's chest with the tenderness of an old dog. His certainty about what animals could and couldn't do had already cracked. Miguel rewound again, this time focusing on the holding door. Lily appeared in the frame, younger than she felt today, a bucket in hand, checking the top latch with a sharp tug. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced down, only for a second. The bottom hinge never got that same firm pull. The camera caught it all. Her leaving, the faint sag of tired metal, the small accident that opened a path. Rocco's image grew more restless. They watched him pace, faster and faster, throwing his weight against the door, not like a beast testing boundaries for fun, but like something urgent and specific was pulling him. On the third shove, the latch gave. The door slipped just enough. He squeezed through, not bolting, not exploding into chaos, but moving with a straight, steady purpose down the service hall. He didn't hesitate, Nora said quietly. No looking around, no testing corners. He knew exactly where he was going. On another screen, they watched him emerge into daylight, blinking once, then lifting his head to scent the air again. His body moved like a compass needle snapping north. Only his north was the frail figure he'd once known as safety. The room felt smaller as they watched Rocco thread through the scattering visitors on the replay, ignoring every easy target, every unguarded back. A little boy dropped a pretzel right in front of him. The jaguar's paw stepped around it, never breaking stride. His gaze never left that one point across the plaza, where a retired veteran had chosen not to run. Ethan let out a long, low breath. "This wasn't an escape," he said, the words sounding strange but true in his own mouth. "He wasn't trying to get away from us." On the screen, Rocco drew closer to Frank, posture soft, ears forward, tail low. The old cat moved like a soldier on one last march, not fleeing a prison, but answering a call. Nora nodded, eyes still on the jaguar framed in pixelated sunlight. "He wasn't running from anything," she answered. "He was going to someone." The distinction settled over the room with quiet weight. On the monitor, Rocco lifted his head toward the man who had once held his whole world in two hands, and even through the camera's cold glass eye, his devotion was unmistakable. Down in the plaza, in real time, the old jaguar stood pressed gently against the veteran's side, the chaos around them muted to a soft hum. Up in the control room, watching both the past and present unfold on their screens, the staff of Desert Ridge Zoo began to understand. For Rocco, this had never been about breaking free. It had always been about finding his way back. For a while, Rocco stayed where he was, pressed gently against the veteran's side, as if anchoring himself to the only solid thing in a shifting world. The heat of the concrete seeped into his paws. Above them, the desert sky stretched wide and bright, but he watched only the man's chest rise and fall. The rhythm was uneven, catching here and there like a wheel over a worn road. The quiet around them didn't last. A new current of sound rolled in. Footsteps, the sharper clip of heels, radios snapping to life. Rocco's ears twitched toward it. A woman's voice cut across the plaza, firm and level, carrying the cold efficiency of command. Even without knowing her words, he knew the type. Leaders always sounded like that when fear got close. Karen Caldwell stepped to the edge of the cleared circle, her zoo badge flashing in the sun. She took in the scene. The Jaguar out of his enclosure, the retired veteran standing inches from a predator, the scattered families clinging to one another. Her jaw tightened. "Trank team, stand ready," she said. "We end this before someone dies on our property." The phrase slid through the air like a draft beneath a door. Rocco didn't know what property meant, but he felt the shift in the humans around him, the way Ethan's stance stiffened, the way Lily's shoulders rose, the way the crowd's fear sharpened again. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, and felt Frank's hand tighten almost imperceptibly in his fur. Nora moved quickly, stepping between Karen and Ethan, palms open. "Look at him," she urged, voice low but steady. "His ears, his tail, his body. He's not in attack mode, Karen. He's choosing to stay with that man. If we hit him now, right here, we're not just stopping an incident. We're breaking something we can't put back together." Karen didn't lower her gaze. "We have children here," she replied. "We have liability. A Jaguar is loose and in contact with an elderly guest. There is no version of the handbook where that ends with a hug and a press release." Her eyes flicked to Frank, then back to Rocco. The old cat met her stare with a calm that didn't comfort her at all. Through all of it, Rocco stayed close to the veteran's side, the way he once stayed pressed against Frank's leg in storms, trusting that nearness was its own kind of shield. The human voices rose and fell around him, sharp here, pleading there. He didn't follow the words, but he read the tones. Some carried threat, some carried worry. One carried sorrow so deep it made his chest ache. That sorrow came from Frank. The man's breathing had grown more labored in the last few minutes, each inhale a little steeper, each exhale a little thinner. Rocco heard the change, the way he heard storms coming long before the first drop fell. He lifted his head to study the man's face and saw something there that hadn't been there in their early days together. A tiredness that went all the way down. A portable medical kit arrived, slung over the shoulder of a zoo medic who edged carefully into the circle. Rocco's muscles tightened, instinct ready to protect his fragile human. But Frank laid a hand flat against the Jaguar's neck, fingers spread, a signal he'd taught him years ago. The message beneath the touch was simple. "It's all right. Let them close." The medic's quick checks, Frank's pulse, his color, the subtle shake in his hand, told a story the man finally chose to say out loud. "You're worried about me dying out here," Frank said, voice hoarse, but somehow lighter. "Truth is, that train already left the station." He managed a faint smile. "Heart failure. Couple of months, if that. I'm not your biggest safety problem today." Rocco didn't know the word failure, but he heard the acceptance in it, the same worn acceptance he felt in his own bones when his legs refused to move the way they once had. The Jaguar shifted, trying to ease some of his weight under Frank's touch, as if sharing a little of his own strength might slow whatever was happening inside that aging chest. Nora met Karen's eyes. "He's end of life," she said quietly, And so is Rocco. You know his chart. Advanced kidney disease, arthritis in both hips. We've been managing comfort, not cure. She glanced at the Jaguar, whose sides rose and fell with careful effort. We're not talking about a long-term risk here. We're talking about how they spend what's left. The director's gaze moved between them. The veteran, the Jaguar, the circling cameras, the trembling families, rules lined up in her mind like neatly typed lines in a policy manual. Then Frank's voice cut through all of it, soft but carrying in the hush. Don't make him die thinking I abandoned him twice, he said. Once was enough to live with. Something in that sentence settled over the plaza like a shadow at dusk. Rocco didn't grasp the weight of the words, but he felt the man's hand tremble as they left his mouth. Instinct rose in the Jaguar, old and stubborn. He nudged Frank's side gently, rumbling low. Not a warning, not a threat, but a promise echoing back from long ago. I'm here. I came. I didn't forget. Karen looked at them, really looked this time. An old soldier with failing heart and fading eyes. An old Jaguar with stiff joints and a coat gone dull in places. Both standing in the center of a panic they hadn't caused, drawn together by something no protocol had ever considered. The handbook in her head fluttered, its pages suddenly less certain. At last she exhaled, the breath long and reluctant. Trank team, stand down, she called, the decision tasting risky on her tongue. We moved them both to the vet center, controlled environment, no separation for now. Around her, shoulders lowered. The crowd didn't cheer. They simply breathed again. And Rocco, hearing the shift in tone, stayed right where he was, pressed against the man who had always been his north, ready to follow him into whatever small stretch of future they had left, as long as they could walk it together. The hallway leading to the veterinary wing was cooler than the plaza, the air humming softly with vents and distant machinery. Rocco moved beside Frank in slow, careful steps, his shoulder brushing the man's hip as if guiding him. Each footfall echoed gently, a steady rhythm that matched the old veteran's uneven breath. The world outside the hall faded behind them, like a door lowering into silence. Staff walked in a loose circle around the pair, giving Rocco as much space as they could without losing control of the situation. Ethan led at the front, rifle lowered, but still held with the cautious respect a man gives a storm that learned to behave. Every few steps he glanced over his shoulder, watching the Jaguar's posture with a mix of awe and disbelief. Frank leaned heavier on his cane than before, though he tried not to show it. Rocco noticed anyway. The Jaguar's tail flicked once, slow and thoughtful, and he moved in closer, his large head brushing the man's arm with a steadiness that made Lily bite her lip. She'd seen animals guard each other, but this was different. This felt intentional, chosen. Not instinct, but devotion. As they turned a corner, the fluorescent lights flickered briefly overhead. The soft stutter of brightness sent a ripple of unease through the escort team. Rocco paused, lifting his head, ears sweeping the hall for threats. When no danger followed, he returned his gaze to Frank, posture relaxing again. Nora whispered, "He's attuned to him. Everything else is secondary." The walk wasn't long, but for Rocco it held weight. Each step carried memories, cold metal crates, strange corridors, scents that led nowhere. Now, at last, he was following a scent that anchored him. He brushed against the veteran again, a gesture halfway between reassurance and claiming. Frank chuckled softly, though the sound came out thin. "Still leaning on me like you did at 15 pounds, he murmured. Inside the vet observation suite, the room was already prepared. Lights low, doors locked, equipment pushed to walls to leave wide, open space. Rocco entered first, lowering his head to inspect corners, his instincts aware but calm. When he was certain the room posed no threat, he circled back and touched his nose to the veteran's hand, guiding him into the center. A folding chair was set out for Frank. He sat carefully, a hand pressed against his chest as he caught his breath. The medic hovered near the door, watching his color shift from gray to slightly less gray. Rocco sank to the floor beside him, joints stiff, spine creaking softly as he lowered his weight. The old cat settled with a long exhale, pressing one paw lightly across the toe of Frank's boot. Nora and Ethan slipped into the adjoining observation room behind the glass. From there, they could monitor, but not intrude. The moment the door sealed, the atmosphere changed. The tension of the plaza, the shouting, the alarms, none of it followed them here. Only the soft hum of the building and the slow, synchronized breathing of an old man and an older cat remained. Frank reached out and let his fingers rest against Rocco's cheek. The Jaguar closed his eyes, leaning into the touch with a deliberate softness that made his whiskers tremble. It was a gesture that held centuries of wild instinct and a tenderness learned from one human alone. "I'm sorry it took me so long," Frank whispered. "Life got away from me." Rocco didn't understand the words, but he knew the tone, the same gentle sorrow he'd felt the night Frank failed to return to the rescue cabin. He had waited then, listening to winds scrape at the walls, believing footsteps would come back for him. Now, with the man's hand warm against his fur once more, something settled inside him, heavy and peaceful. Outside the glass, Ethan watched with arms folded tight across his chest. "This is not an animal in distress," he murmured. Nora nodded beside him. "No, this is an animal finding closure." She swallowed softly. "And maybe a man doing the same." Their voices faded, respectful of the scene they barely understood. Inside the room, Frank shifted slightly, gripping his cane as a wave of dizziness washed over him. Rocco lifted his head immediately, pupils widening in concern. He nudged the man's thigh with a low, rumbling breath, as if urging him to steady himself. Frank laughed weakly. "Still watching out for me, huh?" The old Jaguar laid his head gently across the man's lap, the weight solid and comforting. Frank's wrinkled hand rested on the cat's neck, thumb tracing lazy circles through fading rosettes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Time thinned to a quiet thread between their breaths, stretching only as far as the soft rise and fall of their chests. Outside, cameras recorded, staff whispered, protocols hovered. But in the quiet heart of the vet wing, none of that mattered. For the first time in decades, man and Jaguar sat together with nothing left to chase and nothing left to flee, only the steady peace of having finally found each other again. The days that followed slipped into a gentler rhythm than anything Rocco had known in years. Morning light would creep across the floor of the vet suite, and almost like a ritual, he would rise, slow, careful, and cross the short distance to where Frank rested. He'd lower his head to the man's chest, listening, making sure that same tired heartbeat was still there to greet him. At first, Frank sat in a recliner the staff wheeled in, blanket over his knees, tubes and wires tucked as neatly as they could manage. Rocco would curl along the side of the chair, his spine pressed against the metal frame, content just to feel the faint drumming through the cushions. Nurses came and went, speaking softly, always moving around the Jaguar like he was part of the furniture of that little world. Visitors arrived too. A hospice volunteer with weathered hands who'd seen more endings than she could count. A few of Frank's old service buddies who stood in the doorway with baseball caps in their hands and tears they tried hard to blink back. Even little Mia showed up with drawings of a spotted cat and an old man sitting under a giant cartoon sun. Through it all, Rocco stayed near. He learned the sound of the hospice nurse's shoes, the pattern of Nora's quiet check-ins behind the glass, the steady hum of machines that were there more for comfort than cure. When Frank shifted or coughed, Rocco's ears pricked. When the man's hand dropped from his fur, the Jaguar nudged it back into place with patient insistence. There were good hours when Frank's voice was strong enough to wander back through time. He spoke of the rescue outpost, of the skinny cub who wouldn't sleep unless he was pressed against a human heartbeat, of long nights when a wounded soldier and an orphaned Jaguar kept each other from falling apart. Rocco didn't understand the words, but he understood the warmth in them and the way they loosened something tight in the old man's chest. There were harder hours, too, times when Frank's breathing grew shallow and uneven, when his face pinched with pain he tried to hide. Rocco would rise then, despite the scream in his own hips, and press his body more firmly along the man's side. That solid weight, that steady presence, seemed to smooth some of the jagged edges. The nurses noticed. They let it be. As the days passed, Rocco tired more easily. Getting up took longer. Lying down came with little groans he couldn't quite swallow back. But no matter how heavy his limbs felt, he always forced himself upright when Frank called his name, even if it was only a hoarse whisper in the gray light before dawn. The bond that had pulled him across the zoo held him upright now. One evening, the sky outside the narrow window burned orange and purple, the desert doing its best to dress up the end of the day. Inside, the air felt thinner. Frank asked the nurse for help moving to the floor. "I don't want to be above him," he said softly. "Not for this." It took time and gentle hands, but they settled him on a pallet beside Rocco, eye to eye. The Jaguar shifted with visible effort, curving his body around the man's like a living shield. He laid his head across Frank's shoulder, just as he had done as a cub in that drafty cabin so many years before. Frank's fingers sank into the fur at his neck, holding on the way a drifting man holds a rope. His breath hitched, but his face looked strangely at peace. In that quiet, Rocco listened. The heartbeat he had checked each morning was softer now, slower, as if the drum were finally tiring of its long duty. He rumbled low, the sound deep and gentle, hoping somehow the vibration might coax a few more beats out. Frank's lips moved against his ear. "You did your job, son," he whispered. "You brought me home." The room held still as the last light faded from the window. The nurse stepped back. Nora and Ethan watched from behind the glass, hands pressed unconsciously to the barrier between them and the small circle of goodbye. Rocco felt the man's chest rise under his cheek, once, twice, and then simply, "Not again." The silence that followed was different from any he'd known. It wasn't the quiet of night or sleep. It was an absence. Something ancient rose in him then, deeper than training, older than fences. A low, trembling moan spilled from his chest, rolling through the room like a storm that couldn't find rain. It was not the roar of a predator. It was the broken sound of a companion left behind. He nudged Frank's shoulder gently with his nose, once, twice, as if a firmer touch might call the heart back into motion. No movement answered. The humans cried in their own ways, soft sobs, a bowed head, a whispered prayer. Rocco, having spent nearly his whole life learning to endure cages and distance, did the only thing he knew. He stayed. For hours he lay there, head resting where that heartbeat used to be, waiting for a rhythm that didn't return. In the weeks that followed, the room felt emptier, even when staff came to sit with him. Rocco ate less, slept more, and walked only when he had to. The scent he had chased across the zoo had faded from the air, but traces of it lingered in the blanket where Frank had lain. He would curl there, draw in what was left, and let his eyes close. When his own time finally came, it was quiet. One morning, he simply didn't rise to greet the light. Nora found him stretched on the pallet, breathing slow to a whisper, eyes half-lidded, as if watching something only he could see. She knelt beside him, hand on his shoulder, and felt the last tremor of life leave him with a soft sigh, as though he were following a familiar trail just beyond their sight. Months later, near the Jaguar exhibit, the zoo unveiled a bronze statue, an old man seated on a low rock, hand resting on the broad head of a spotted cat at his side. Visitors stopped, some in silence, some with tears they didn't expect. On the plaque beneath, simple words were carved. Some bonds survive every war. And for those who paused to read, the story of Rocco and Frank lived on, not as a tale of danger, but as a reminder that even the wildest hearts remember where they once found home. If this story touched your heart, even for a moment, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave one simple word in the comments, something as small as honor or love. It lets me know you're here and that these stories still mean something in this world. And if you'd like to travel with me through the next chapter, through more true stories of courage, loyalty, and the unexpected bonds that shape our lives, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe. Your presence here matters more than you know. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.